By the final years of World War II, the world had already begun to change. The early image of German dominance, marked by rapid victories and unstoppable momentum, had started to collapse under the weight of a prolonged and exhausting conflict. What once seemed like a perfectly coordinated war machine was now struggling to maintain its position. The Eastern Front was crumbling as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, pushing German troops back step by step. In the West, Allied forces had successfully landed in Normandy and were steadily moving deeper into occupied Europe. Germany was losing ground, but more importantly, it was losing time. Yet inside the leadership of the Third Reich, there was still a belief, stubborn and unwavering, that the war was not yet lost. This belief did not come from reality on the battlefield, but from an idea. An idea that had appeared many times throughout history, that a single breakthrough, a single powerful innovation, could change everything. For Germany, that idea became known as the wonder weapon. The concept was simple but incredibly ambitious. If a weapon could be created that was advanced enough, faster, stronger, and more unpredictable than anything the enemy had ever seen, it could disrupt Allied operations, create fear, and possibly force a shift in the balance of power. It would not just be a weapon. It would be a turning point. And among all the experimental projects being developed at the time, one stood out above all others. The V-2 rocket. Unlike traditional weapons, the V-2 was something entirely new. It did not rely on soldiers, aircraft, or artillery positions in the usual sense. It was launched from the ground, traveled high into the atmosphere, and then descended toward its target at incredible speed. It moved faster than the speed of sound, making it impossible to intercept using any existing defense systems. There was no warning, no time to react, only the explosion. This alone made it one of the most terrifying weapons of the war. But the V-2 was not just a weapon of destruction. It was a symbol of how far technology had advanced, and how warfare itself was changing. It represented a shift from visible combat to unseen strikes, from predictable attacks to sudden devastation. The origins of this weapon were not purely military. Years before the war, scientists and engineers had been experimenting with rocket technology, driven by curiosity and ambition. They were interested in propulsion, in reaching higher altitudes, in exploring what might be possible beyond the limits of conventional engines. These early experiments were often unstable and unpredictable, but they laid the foundation for what would come later. As the war intensified, these scientific ideas were transformed into military projects. Resources were allocated, teams were formed, facilities were built. What had once been theoretical became urgent. The pressure to deliver results increased with each passing month, especially as Germany's position on the battlefield worsened. The development process was far from smooth. Rockets exploded during testing. Guidance systems failed. Fuel mixtures proved unstable. Engineers faced constant setbacks, each one consuming valuable time and resources. But they continued, because the stakes were too high to stop. Eventually, progress was made. The rocket became more stable. The guidance systems improved. The design evolved into something that could be used in real conditions. It was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a weapon. At the same time, Germany faced another problem: production. Unlike conventional weapons, which could be manufactured relatively quickly and in large quantities, the V-2 required precision. Each component had to be carefully assembled. Each system had to function perfectly. This made mass production extremely difficult. And yet, production was necessary. Because a weapon that could not be deployed in sufficient numbers could not change the course of a war. To protect the production process from Allied bombing, factories were moved underground. Hidden facilities were constructed, where rockets could be assembled away from enemy aircraft. These locations provided some level of security, but they also introduced new challenges. Working conditions were harsh, efficiency was difficult to maintain, and transportation of materials became more complicated. Still, the work continued. Because the belief in the weapon remained strong. By the time the V-2 was ready for deployment, the war had already entered its final phase. Allied forces were advancing rapidly, and Germany's ability to respond was diminishing. Yet the introduction of this new weapon created a moment of uncertainty. When the first rockets were launched, the effect was immediate. Cities were struck without warning. Explosions appeared suddenly, with no visible cause. Civilians were confused, then frightened. The idea that a weapon could strike at any moment, without any sign of approach, created a new kind of fear. This was exactly what the weapon was designed to do. Not just destroy, but shock. However, even in these early moments, questions began to emerge. Could it be produced fast enough? Could it be used effectively enough? Could it actually change the outcome of the war? Because while the V-2 was powerful, the situation around it continued to deteriorate. Germany was still losing territory. Its armies were still retreating. Its resources were still being depleted. The weapon was extraordinary. But the war was not standing still. And as the days passed, the gap between what the V-2 could achieve and what it needed to achieve began to grow. The idea of a secret weapon that could win the war was still alive. But reality was beginning to challenge that idea. And the question remained, was this weapon the future of warfare? Or simply a final, desperate attempt that had come too late? As the V-2 program moved beyond its experimental phase, the focus shifted from possibility to execution. The weapon had proven that it could work, at least in controlled conditions. Now the challenge was far greater. It had to be produced, transported, and deployed in the middle of a war that was rapidly turning against Germany. This transition revealed a harsh reality. Creating a powerful weapon in theory was one thing. Using it effectively in a collapsing war effort was something entirely different. To protect the program from Allied bombing, production was relocated underground. One of the most important facilities was hidden within a vast network of tunnels carved deep into the earth. These underground factories were designed to shield the operation from air attacks, allowing work to continue even as cities above were being destroyed. Inside these tunnels, the environment was difficult and relentless. The air was thick, the lighting dim, and the working conditions far from ideal. Machinery echoed through the corridors, and the pressure to meet production targets was constant. Every rocket required careful assembly, and even the smallest mistake could result in failure. Time was always running out. Engineers and workers operated under intense pressure, knowing that delays could have consequences far beyond the factory walls. The war was not waiting for them to perfect their designs. It was advancing, hour by hour, day by day. Despite these challenges, production continued. Rockets were assembled piece by piece, each one representing a complex combination of engineering, material, and labor. Fuel systems had to be installed precisely. Guidance mechanisms had to be calibrated. Structural components had to withstand extreme conditions during launch and flight. Nothing could be left to chance. Yet even with all this effort, production numbers remained limited. The V-2 was not a weapon that could be produced in massive quantities like rifles or artillery shells. It required specialized materials, skilled labor, and time, three things that Germany was rapidly running out of. This created a fundamental problem. The weapon was powerful, but it was not scalable. At the same time, the logistics of deploying the V-2 added another layer of complexity. Once a rocket was assembled, it had to be transported to a launch site. These sites needed to be mobile, hidden, and prepared quickly to avoid detection. Launch crews had to work efficiently, setting up equipment, fueling the rocket, and completing all necessary checks before firing. The entire process had to be completed under the constant threat of Allied reconnaissance. Aircraft patrolled the skies, searching for signs of activity. Intelligence networks gathered information, trying to identify launch locations. Every movement carried risk. To counter this, German forces relied on mobility. Launch units moved frequently, setting up temporary sites and relocating after each launch. This reduced the chances of being targeted, but it also made operations more difficult. Equipment had to be transported, assembled, and disassembled repeatedly, increasing the chances of errors. Even under these conditions, launches continued. Each successful launch demonstrated the weapon's capability. Rockets would rise into the sky, disappearing from view before descending toward their targets at incredible speed. The absence of warning made them uniquely effective in creating shock and confusion. But effectiveness in one area did not guarantee overall success. Accuracy remained a significant issue. While the V-2 could reach general target areas, it could not reliably hit specific military objectives. This meant that many rockets struck civilian areas rather than strategic targets. While this created fear and destruction, it did not significantly weaken Allied military capabilities. This limitation reduced the weapon's strategic value. At the same time, Allied forces were not passive. Intelligence efforts began to focus on identifying and disrupting the V-2 program. Reconnaissance missions gathered information about potential launch sites and production facilities. Resistance networks provided additional insights, helping to build a clearer picture of the operation. Once targets were identified, bombing campaigns were launched. While underground facilities were difficult to destroy, the infrastructure supporting them, transportation routes, supply lines, and storage areas, remained vulnerable. Attacks on these targets disrupted production and slowed deployment. Each disruption had an impact. Fewer rockets could be produced. Fewer launches could be carried out. The weapon's overall effectiveness decreased. Meanwhile, the broader war continued to move forward. Allied forces advanced across Europe, capturing territory and cutting off key supply routes. German defenses weakened, and the ability to coordinate large-scale operations diminished. The V-2 program, despite its importance, could not operate independently of these larger conditions. It was part of a system that was breaking down. This created a growing contradiction. On one hand, the V-2 represented one of the most advanced technologies of the war. It was fast, powerful, and impossible to intercept. On the other hand, it was being used in a context where resources were limited, time was short, and strategic options were narrowing. The weapon was ahead of its time. But the war it was part of was already reaching its conclusion. Inside the German leadership, the belief in the V-2 remained strong. There was still hope that increased production, improved deployment, and continued pressure on Allied cities could create an opportunity. Even a small shift in momentum could be valuable, especially in a war where every advantage mattered. But hope was not the same as reality. The challenges facing the program were not temporary. They were structural. They were tied to the overall condition of Germany's war effort, which continued to deteriorate. As the months passed, it became increasingly clear that the V-2, while impressive, could not operate in isolation. It depended on resources, logistics, and strategic support, factors that were becoming more limited with each passing day. And as these limitations grew, the question that had once seemed hopeful began to take on a different tone. Not whether the weapon could win the war, but whether it had ever truly had the chance. Because in the end, even the most advanced weapon cannot succeed if everything around it is falling apart. And that was exactly the situation Germany now faced. As V-2 rockets began striking Allied cities more frequently, their true impact started to extend beyond physical destruction and into the psychological realm. Unlike traditional bombing raids, there were no warning sirens, no approaching aircraft, and no visible threat in the sky. The explosion came first, followed by shock and confusion. This made the V-2 fundamentally different from anything civilians had experienced before. In cities like London, where people had already endured years of air raids, this new type of attack introduced a deeper level of uncertainty. Daily life continued, but it was overshadowed by the knowledge that danger could arrive at any moment without warning. Streets that appeared calm could suddenly become sites of destruction. Buildings that had stood for decades could be reduced to rubble in seconds. The unpredictability created a constant sense of tension. Yet despite this, the overall structure of civilian life did not collapse. People adapted. Services continued to operate, and resilience once again became a defining feature of the population. This revealed an important limitation of the weapon. While it was capable of creating fear, it was not capable of breaking morale entirely. At the same time, the physical effects of the V-2 were closely observed. Each rocket carried a powerful explosive payload, capable of destroying buildings and causing significant casualties within its immediate impact zone. When it struck densely populated areas, the damage could be severe and sudden. However, compared to large-scale bombing campaigns involving multiple aircraft and repeated strikes, the overall impact remained limited. The V-2 operated on a different scale. Each launch resulted in a single explosion, affecting a specific location rather than an entire district. Even with multiple launches over time, the cumulative destruction did not match the level of damage caused by sustained bombing operations. This reduced its effectiveness as a strategic weapon. Another critical limitation was accuracy. Although the V-2 could travel long distances and reach general target areas, it could not reliably hit precise military objectives. This meant that many of its strikes affected civilian areas rather than critical infrastructure. While this contributed to psychological pressure, it did not significantly disrupt military operations. Meanwhile, the broader war continued to move forward. Allied forces were advancing steadily across Europe. In the west, troops pushed through France and into German territory. In the east, Soviet forces continued their advance toward Berlin. With each passing day, Germany's ability to sustain resistance weakened. The V-2 program, despite its advanced technology, could not change this reality. It could strike cities, but it could not stop armies. Another factor that became increasingly significant was the cost of the program. Producing each V-2 rocket required substantial resources, including specialized materials, skilled labor, and complex manufacturing processes. At a time when Germany was facing severe shortages, dedicating such resources to a single weapon created significant strain. These resources could have been used elsewhere. They could have supported conventional weapons production, reinforced defensive systems, or supplied frontline troops. Instead, they were concentrated on a program that, while impressive, delivered limited strategic results. This created a growing imbalance within the war effort. The decision to prioritize the V-2 reflected a belief that technological innovation could compensate for other weaknesses. But as the war progressed, it became clear that this assumption was flawed. At the same time, Allied intelligence efforts continued to improve. Information about the V-2 program was gathered through reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and resistance networks. This allowed the Allies to identify key elements of the program, including production facilities, transportation routes, and launch sites. Although the rockets themselves could not be intercepted, the systems supporting them could be targeted. Bombing raids disrupted supply chains and damaged infrastructure. Transportation routes were attacked, slowing the movement of materials and finished rockets. Launch sites were monitored, reducing their effectiveness. Each of these actions limited the number of rockets that could be deployed. As a result, the overall impact of the V-2 program began to decline. What had initially been a shocking and unpredictable threat gradually became more manageable. Civilians adapted to the new reality, and military planners adjusted their strategies accordingly. The weapon remained dangerous, but it no longer held the same level of uncertainty. By early 1945, the situation had become clear. Germany was losing the war. Territory was being lost rapidly, resources were depleted, and military capabilities were weakening. The V-2 program continued, but it was no longer viewed as a potential solution to the larger problem. Instead, it became a symbol of technological achievement, but also a symbol of missed opportunity. It represented what might have been possible under different circumstances, but also highlighted the limitations of relying on a single advanced weapon to change the outcome of a complex and large-scale conflict. The question that had once driven the program now took on a different meaning. Not whether the V-2 could win the war, but why it could not. And as the war moved toward its final stage, the answer to that question would become increasingly unavoidable. By the time the war entered its final months, the role of the V-2 had shifted from a potential turning point to a symbol of Germany's final efforts to change an already determined outcome. The weapon continued to be used, and rockets were still launched toward Allied cities, but the expectations surrounding it had begun to fade. Reality had taken over. Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. In this context, the limitations of the V-2 became impossible to ignore. One of the most significant factors was timing. The weapon had reached operational status too late in the war. By the time it was deployed in meaningful numbers, Allied forces had already gained momentum on multiple fronts. The strategic balance had shifted, and reversing it required more than a single technological breakthrough. The V-2 arrived into a war that was already being lost. Another factor was scale. Even at its peak, the number of rockets that could be produced and launched was limited. Each rocket required significant resources, time, and coordination. This meant that the weapon could not be deployed in the quantities necessary to create sustained pressure on Allied infrastructure or military operations. It was powerful, but not numerous enough. At the same time, its strategic use remained limited. Because of its lack of precision, the V-2 was primarily used against cities rather than specific military targets. While this caused destruction and casualties, it did not significantly weaken the enemy's ability to fight. Factories continued to operate. Supply lines remained functional. Military units continued to advance. The weapon created impact, but not advantage. Meanwhile, the broader situation continued to deteriorate. Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory. Cities were captured. Supply lines were cut. The ability to coordinate large-scale operations weakened further. Every day reduced the chances of any meaningful recovery. The V-2 program continued within this environment, but it could not exist independently of it. It relied on resources that were becoming scarce. It depended on infrastructure that was being destroyed. It required time that no longer existed. This created a situation where the weapon's potential could never fully be realized. Even if improvements had been made, even if production had increased, the surrounding conditions would still have limited its effectiveness. Technology alone was not enough. Another important aspect was the allocation of resources. The investment in the V-2 program had been significant. Materials, labor, and industrial capacity had been directed toward its development and production. These resources were taken from other areas of the war effort, creating gaps that could not easily be filled. This decision reflected a strategic gamble. The belief that a single advanced weapon could compensate for broader weaknesses. But as the war progressed, it became clear that this approach was not sustainable. Wars are not decided by a single factor. They are influenced by a combination of resources, strategy, coordination, and time. The V-2, while advanced, could not replace these elements. At the same time, the weapon's legacy was already beginning to take shape. Despite its limited impact on the outcome of the war, it represented a major step forward in technology. The principles behind its design would influence future developments in missile systems, space exploration, and military strategy. In this sense, the V-2 was ahead of its time. It showed what was possible. But it also showed what was required to make such possibilities effective. The lessons learned from its use were not limited to Germany. They would be studied, analyzed, and applied by other nations in the years that followed. The concept of long-range missile warfare would become a defining feature of future conflicts. But in the context of World War II, the V-2 remained limited. It was introduced too late. It was produced in insufficient numbers. It lacked the precision needed for strategic impact. And it operated within a war effort that was already collapsing. These factors combined to define its role. Not as a weapon that could win the war, but as a weapon that revealed the limits of relying on technology alone. Looking back, the idea that the V-2 could have changed the outcome reflects a moment of hope in an otherwise desperate situation. It represents the belief that innovation could overcome reality. That a single breakthrough could reverse the course of events. But history showed otherwise. The war continued. Allied forces advanced. Germany's position weakened further. And eventually, the conflict came to an end. The V-2 remained, not as a decisive weapon, but as a powerful example of what could be achieved, and what could not. It was a glimpse into the future. But it belonged to a war that was already ending. And in that sense, it became something more than just a weapon. It became a lesson. A reminder that even the most advanced technology must be supported by strategy, resources, and timing. Without these, its potential remains unrealized. And the secret weapon that once promised victory becomes the weapon that explains why victory was no longer possible. Even as the V-2 continued to be launched in the final months of the war, attention within German leadership did not remain fixed on a single weapon. The idea of the Wunderwaffe extended beyond the V-2, encompassing a range of experimental technologies that were believed to hold the potential to change the course of the conflict. These projects reflected both innovation and desperation, combining advanced engineering with the urgent need for results. Among these developments, one of the most notable was the introduction of jet-powered aircraft. Unlike traditional propeller-driven planes, jet aircraft were faster, more difficult to intercept, and capable of outperforming many Allied fighters. The most famous of these was the Me-262, a jet fighter that represented a significant leap forward in aviation technology. When it entered combat, it demonstrated clear advantages in speed and firepower. Pilots who encountered it often found themselves unable to respond effectively. For a brief period, it seemed as though this technology might offer a way to regain control of the skies. But once again, timing played a critical role. The Me-262 was introduced too late and in insufficient numbers. Production was limited, fuel shortages restricted its use, and training pilots for such advanced aircraft required time that was no longer available. While it was technologically superior, it could not be deployed on a scale large enough to influence the overall outcome. This pattern was not unique. Other projects followed a similar trajectory. Advanced submarine designs, including improved U-boats, were developed with the goal of disrupting Allied shipping routes. These submarines incorporated new technologies that allowed for longer underwater operation and reduced detection. In theory, they could have posed a serious threat to supply lines. But again, they arrived too late. Allied anti-submarine tactics had already improved, and control of the Atlantic had shifted. Even the most advanced designs could not overcome the strategic disadvantage Germany now faced. At the same time, research into new forms of weaponry continued. Concepts involving guided missiles, advanced explosives, and unconventional systems were explored. Each project carried the hope that it might provide the breakthrough needed to shift momentum. But each also faced the same limitations: resources, time, and the rapidly changing situation on the battlefield. The V-2 remained the most developed of these weapons. It was the closest to achieving operational success. But even it could not escape the broader reality. Germany was losing the war on multiple fronts, and no single innovation could reverse that trend. This raised an important question. Why did the focus remain on these advanced weapons, despite the challenges? Part of the answer lies in psychology. For leaders facing defeat, the idea of a breakthrough offered hope. It provided a sense of control in a situation that was increasingly defined by loss. Investing in advanced technology allowed them to believe that the future could still be shaped, even as the present became more uncertain. But this belief also carried risks. Resources were diverted away from immediate needs. Conventional forces, which were essential for holding territory and defending positions, received less support. The emphasis on innovation came at the expense of practicality. This imbalance became more pronounced as the war progressed. Frontline units struggled with shortages of equipment and supplies. Defensive positions weakened. Coordination between different branches of the military became more difficult. The focus on advanced weapons did not address these issues. Instead, it highlighted them. The contrast between technological ambition and operational reality became impossible to ignore. At the same time, the Allies were not standing still. Their own technological developments continued, supported by stronger industrial capacity and more stable supply chains. Radar systems improved. Aircraft production increased. Communication networks became more effective. These developments, combined with strategic coordination, strengthened their overall position. This created a widening gap. Germany was investing heavily in a small number of advanced projects. The Allies were strengthening multiple areas simultaneously. The difference in approach had significant consequences. While Germany focused on potential breakthroughs, the Allies focused on consistency and scale. This allowed them to maintain pressure across all fronts, reducing the effectiveness of any single German response. In this context, the V-2 and other Wunderwaffe projects can be seen as part of a larger pattern. They represented a belief in innovation as a solution to structural problems. But structural problems require structural solutions. Technology can enhance capability, but it cannot replace strategy, resources, and coordination. As the war moved closer to its conclusion, this distinction became clearer. The advanced weapons remained impressive. They demonstrated what was possible. But they also revealed what was missing. The conditions needed to make them decisive were no longer present. And so, the focus shifted once again. From what these weapons could do, to what they could not. The V-2 was not alone in this. It was part of a broader effort that, while remarkable in its ambition, ultimately faced the same limitations. The war was not being decided by a single factor. It was being decided by the combined weight of many. And in that balance, even the most advanced technology could not tip the scales. As the war entered its final stage, the gap between technological ambition and battlefield reality became impossible to ignore. The V-2 program, along with other advanced weapons, continued to operate, but it now existed within a system that was rapidly collapsing. The question was no longer whether these weapons could change the outcome, but whether they had ever truly had the opportunity to do so. By early 1945, Germany faced a situation that was beyond recovery. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces advanced with overwhelming strength, capturing territory and pushing toward Berlin. In the West, Allied troops continued their advance, supported by strong supply lines and air superiority. German defenses weakened, and coordination between units became increasingly difficult. The war had reached a point where momentum could not be reversed easily. In this environment, the V-2 program continued to operate, but its role had changed. It was no longer seen as a decisive solution. It had become a final effort to maintain pressure. Rockets were still launched, and targets were still selected, but the scale and impact of these operations were limited by the broader conditions. Production continued under difficult circumstances, and each launch required coordination that was becoming harder to maintain. At the same time, Allied forces adapted. The initial shock created by the V-2 had diminished. Civilians had learned to cope with the uncertainty, and military planners had adjusted their strategies. While the rockets remained dangerous, they no longer created the same level of disruption. This shift reduced their effectiveness further. Another important factor was infrastructure. The systems required to support the V-2 program, factories, transportation networks, and launch sites, were increasingly under threat. Bombing campaigns targeted key areas, disrupting production and slowing operations. Each disruption had a cumulative effect, reducing the number of rockets that could be produced and deployed. Logistics became a major challenge. Moving materials, assembling rockets, and preparing launch sites required coordination that was becoming more difficult as communication systems weakened. Delays increased, and efficiency decreased. These challenges were not unique to the V-2 program. They affected all aspects of the German war effort. But for a weapon that depended on precision and coordination, the impact was particularly significant. At the same time, the allocation of resources continued to raise questions. The investment in advanced weapons had been substantial, but the returns were limited. As shortages increased, the opportunity cost of these investments became more apparent. Resources that could have supported frontline units or strengthened defenses had been directed elsewhere. This created a growing imbalance. The focus on advanced technology had not addressed the immediate needs of the war effort. Instead, it had highlighted the gap between what was possible and what was practical. Meanwhile, the Allies continued to strengthen their position. Industrial production remained strong, supply lines were secure, and coordination between different forces improved. This allowed them to maintain consistent pressure, reducing the effectiveness of any isolated response. The contrast between the two sides became increasingly clear. One relied on a small number of advanced solutions. The other relied on a broad and coordinated strategy. In this comparison, the limitations of the V-2 became more evident. It was a powerful weapon, but it was not part of a system capable of supporting its full potential. This distinction is critical. Technology does not operate in isolation. It requires a foundation of resources, infrastructure, and strategy. Without these, even the most advanced systems cannot achieve their intended impact. As the war moved toward its conclusion, the role of the V-2 became more symbolic. It represented innovation, ambition, and the desire to overcome adversity through technology. But it also represented the limits of that approach. The weapon had shown what was possible. But it had also shown what was necessary. And what was necessary was no longer available. The final months of the war confirmed this reality. Allied forces continued to advance, capturing key positions and reducing German capabilities. The ability to coordinate large-scale operations diminished further, and the focus shifted toward survival rather than strategy. In this context, the V-2 could not change the outcome. It could not create a turning point. It could not reverse the direction of the war. It remained active, but its role was limited. And as the end approached, the focus shifted once again. From what the weapon could do, to what it had revealed. Because in the end, the V-2 was more than just a weapon. It was a demonstration of technological possibility. But also a demonstration of its limits. And those limits would define its place in history. As the final collapse of Nazi Germany drew closer, the story of the V-2 rocket and the broader, Wonder Weapons, program began to take on a different meaning. What had once been seen as a potential solution was now viewed through the lens of inevitability. The war was ending, and the outcome could no longer be changed. Yet the existence of these weapons still carried significance, not because of what they achieved, but because of what they represented. By April 1945, Germany was surrounded. Berlin itself had become a battlefield. Soviet forces pushed into the city from the east, while Allied troops advanced from the west. Communication lines were breaking down, command structures were weakening, and the ability to coordinate any large-scale response had effectively disappeared. In this environment, the V-2 program continued, but only in fragments. Some launch units remained active, carrying out operations where possible. Rockets were still being fired, but the frequency and coordination were far below earlier levels. The infrastructure needed to support the program was no longer intact, and each launch became more difficult to execute. The weapon had not changed. But everything around it had. This highlighted one of the most important lessons of the entire program. A weapon, no matter how advanced, cannot function effectively without the system that supports it. Production facilities had been damaged or disrupted. Transportation networks were unreliable. Supply lines were broken. Under these conditions, even the most advanced technology could not operate as intended. At the same time, the broader significance of the V-2 began to emerge. Although it had not changed the outcome of the war, it had introduced a new concept, one that would have lasting implications far beyond the conflict in which it was used. The idea of long-range, high-speed missile warfare. For the first time, it had been demonstrated that a target could be struck from a distance without warning and without the possibility of interception. This concept would not disappear with the end of the war. Instead, it would become the foundation for future developments. Engineers and scientists who had worked on the V-2 would later continue their work in different contexts. The knowledge gained during its development would be studied and expanded upon. The principles of rocket propulsion, guidance systems, and long-range targeting would influence both military and civilian technologies in the years that followed. In this way, the V-2 achieved something unexpected. It did not win the war. But it changed the future. However, this legacy came with a complex set of implications. The conditions under which the V-2 was developed and produced were difficult and often harsh. The resources invested in the program came at the expense of other areas of the war effort. The decision to prioritize such a weapon reflected both ambition and desperation. These factors are part of the story. They provide context for understanding not just the weapon itself, but the environment in which it was created. At the same time, the end of the war brought a shift in focus. From development to reflection, historians, analysts, and military planners began to examine the role of advanced technology in warfare. The V-2 became a case study, illustrating both the potential and the limitations of relying on a single breakthrough. Several key conclusions emerged. First, timing is critical. Even the most advanced technology cannot change the outcome if it is introduced too late. Second, scale matters. A weapon must be produced and deployed in sufficient numbers to have a meaningful impact. Third, integration is essential. Technology must be part of a broader strategy, supported by resources, infrastructure, and coordination. The V-2 met some of these conditions. But not all, and the absence of the others limited its effectiveness. As the war came to an end, these lessons became more important. They would influence future decisions, shaping how nations approached technological development and military strategy. The V-2 was no longer just a weapon. It had become a reference point, a symbol of what could be achieved, and a reminder of what was required to make such achievements effective. In the final days of the conflict, as Germany's position collapsed completely, the role of the V-2 faded. Not because it was no longer functional, but because the war itself was ending. The outcome had been decided, and no single weapon could change that. Yet the story did not end there. Because the ideas behind the V-2 would continue to evolve. They would move beyond the battlefield. They would shape future technologies. And they would influence the direction of modern warfare. But within the context of World War II, the conclusion was clear. The secret weapon that had promised so much had arrived too late. And as the final chapter of the war unfolded, its role became part of a larger story. A story not of victory, but of limits. As the war finally came to an end, the story of the V-2 rocket remained one of the most complex and debated aspects of the conflict. It was not simply a weapon, and it was not merely a failed attempt to change the outcome. It was something in between, a glimpse of what the future could hold, placed within a moment where the present could no longer be saved. Germany's surrender marked the conclusion of a long and devastating war, but it also marked the beginning of a new era. The technologies developed during the conflict did not disappear. Instead, they were examined, studied, and adapted by those who had witnessed their potential. Among these technologies, the V-2 stood out. It had demonstrated that it was possible to strike targets at great distances with incredible speed, without warning, and without the possibility of interception. This concept would go on to shape military strategy for decades. It would influence the development of missile systems, redefine defense planning, and eventually contribute to entirely new fields of technology. But within the context of World War II, its role was far more limited. It did not stop the Allied advance. It did not force negotiations. It did not change the outcome. The reasons for this are clear when viewed as part of a larger picture. The weapon was introduced too late. Production was limited. Accuracy was insufficient for strategic targets. Resources were constrained. And perhaps most importantly, it was not integrated into a system capable of supporting its full potential. These factors combined to define its impact. The V-2 was powerful, but it was isolated. It was advanced, but it was unsupported. It was innovative, but it was mistimed. This combination ensured that it could not achieve what it was designed to do. Yet the idea behind it did not fail. The concept of long-range missile warfare would become one of the defining elements of modern conflict. The principles demonstrated by the V-2 would be refined, expanded, and applied in ways that extended far beyond the original vision. In this sense, the V-2 succeeded, not in winning the war, but in shaping what came after. This dual nature is what makes its story so compelling. It represents both success and failure, achievement and limitation, innovation and consequence. It shows how technology can push boundaries, but also how those boundaries are defined by the conditions in which that technology exists. The belief that a single weapon could change the course of the war was not unique to Germany. It has appeared in many forms throughout history. The idea of a decisive breakthrough, a moment where everything shifts, is powerful. But it is rarely accurate. Wars are complex. They are influenced by multiple factors, working together over time. No single weapon, no matter how advanced, can replace this complexity. The V-2 serves as a reminder of this reality. It demonstrates that innovation must be matched with strategy. That potential must be supported by resources. That timing is just as important as capability. Without these elements, even the most advanced technologies cannot achieve their intended goals. Looking back, the V-2 is often remembered as a secret weapon that could have won the war. But this perspective overlooks the conditions in which it existed. It assumes that technology alone determines outcomes. And history shows that this is not the case. The V-2 was not a missed opportunity. It was a reflection of its time. A product of ambition, pressure, and the desire to overcome impossible odds. It showed what could be done. But it also showed what was required. And in the end, what was required was no longer available. The war continued. The Allies advanced. Germany collapsed. And the V-2 became part of history. Not as the weapon that changed everything, but as the weapon that revealed why everything could not be changed. Its legacy lives on. In the technologies it inspired. In the lessons it provided. And in the story it tells about the limits of innovation in the face of reality. The secret weapon that could have won the war ultimately became the weapon that explained why it did not.